With the WINN FM News, I am Kevin Brown. Our top stories: IMF World Bank Spring Meeting 2025 opens amidst global trade war. St. Kitts Nevis Prime Minister continues to advocate youth empowerment through sports. Caribbean secures significant exemption from U.S. tariffs on Chinese-built ships amid new trade measures. Tributes pour in from the region following the death of Pope Francis. Internationally, U.S. growth forecast to be hit hardest from Donald Trump's tariffs, International Monetary Fund says. Now, the details. The 2025 IMF World Bank Spring Meeting commenced amid heightened global economic uncertainty, marked by an escalating trade war and ongoing geopolitical conflicts, including the war in Russia and Ukraine and the recent hostilities involving Israel and Hezbollah forces in Gaza. Against this backdrop, small island developing states SIDS such as St. Kitts and Nevis face heightened risk due to their deep dependence on international trade for essential goods and services. During her opening address, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva highlighted the precarious state of the global economy while offering cautious optimism that a global recession is not imminent.
6 months ago, in this very place, I spoke of low growth and high debt. But I also spoke about resilience, countries surviving large shocks thanks to strong fundamentals and agile policies. This resilience is being tested again by the reboot of the global trading system. Financial markets volatility is up, and trade policy uncertainty is literally off the charts.
She elaborated on the perfect storm of factors fueling the tensions: an erosion of trust in the international system, trade distortions, and a resurgence of national security concerns reshaping global supply chains.
Trust in the international system and trust between countries. Global economic integration has lifted vast number of people out of poverty and made the world as a whole better off. But not everyone benefited. Communities were hollowed out by jobs going overseas. Wages were repressed by the growing availability of low-cost labor. Prices jumped up when global supply chains were interrupted. Many blame the international economic system for the perceived lack of fairness in their lives. Trade distortions, tariffs, and non-tariff barriers have fed negative perceptions of a multilateral system seen to have failed to deliver a level playing field.
Georgieva underscored the nonlinear dynamics of the current trade environment, noting that large economic powers such as China, the European Union, and the United States have instituted tariffs that revert to historical levels not seen in decades, with smaller nations inevitably swept up in the cross currents.
China, the EU, and the United States, despite having relatively low imports to GDP, are the world's 3 largest importers. Key implications? Size matters. Their actions impact the rest of the world. Smaller advanced economies and most emerging markets rely more on trade for their growth and are thus more exposed, including to tighter financial conditions.
She pinpointed 3 significant consequences. First, uncertainty, which disrupts complex global supply chains and postpones investment. Second, the immediate growth impacts of rising tariffs, which increase costs for consumers and businesses. And third, protectionism's long-term erosion of productivity, particularly in smaller economies where shielding industries undermines innovation and competitive allocation of resources.
Ultimately, trade is like water. When countries put an obstacle in the form of tariff and non-tariff barriers, the flow diverts. Some sectors in some countries may be flooded by cheap imports. Others may see shortages.
Georgieva commented, highlighting the economic costs that have been quantified in the IMF's World Economic Outlook. Financial markets have reacted uneasily to the environment of uncertainty with unusual volatility in key bond and currency markets.
Earlier this month, we saw unusual movements in some key bond and currency markets. Here we see how, despite elevated uncertainty, the dollar depreciated and U.S. Treasury yields the curves of U.S. Treasury smiled. Not the sort of smile one wants to see. Such movements should be taken as a warning.
Despite the challenges, the IMF chief stressed that decisive and collaborative policy making can chart a path forward. She urged countries, both large and small, to
redouble efforts to put their own houses in order.
Through resolute financial consolidation, credible monetary policy, prudent regulation, and exchange rate flexibility where appropriate. For low-income countries, Georgieva acknowledged the particular difficulties faced.
Tighter budget constraints will entail difficult choices everywhere, but nowhere more so than in low-income countries. Here, weak revenues necessitate stronger efforts for domestic resource mobilization, but also call for support from international partners, both to improve capacity for reforms and to secure critical financial assistance.
She further called for a proactive resolution of debt sustainability issues, referencing the forthcoming Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable's playbook, which aims to guide countries through debt restructuring processes. On the subject of global imbalances, Georgieva remarked that rebalancing internal and external macroeconomic positions is critical for overall stability. Highlighting China, the EU, and the United States, she outlined specific policy recommendations including boosting private consumption in China, fiscal expansion and integration reforms in the European Union, and reducing federal budget deficits in the US.
In trade policy, the goal must be to secure a settlement among the largest players that preserve openness and deliver, very important, deliver a more leveled playing field. To restart a global trend towards lower tariff rates while also reducing non-tariff barriers and distortions. We need a more resilient world economy, not a drift to division.
She underscored the necessity of policies that cushion those negatively affected by trade policy adjustments, emphasizing that
distributional policies form a fundamental bridge between good economics and good politics.
Looking ahead to the spring meeting's role, Georgieva expressed hope that the forum of 91 member countries would foster vital dialogue during this critical juncture.
All countries, large and small alike, can and should play their part to strengthen the global economy in an era of more frequent and severe shocks.
She concluded on a hopeful note, reflecting on her years of public service.
A challenge also creates an opportunity. Pushed hard enough, things that were not possible become possible. Mountains that couldn't be climbed are climbed. Vested interests that would not retreat are overcome. With cool heads, clear vision, and strong will, times of change can be times of renewal. The secret to seizing the moment is to focus all energy not on preserving the old, but on building the new, a better balanced, more resilient world economy.
IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva. On April 19, 2025, the newly upgraded St. Peter's Hard Court was alive with excitement as the National Basketball Camp officially opened. The Honorable Dr. Terence Drew, Prime Minister and Parliamentary Representative for Constituency Number 8, delivered an impactful address marking the beginning of this transformative initiative. The basketball camp provides more than just an athletic outlet. It represents a critical component of the government's citizen security agenda, designed to create meaningful opportunities and pathways for young people across the Federation. Camp participants are actively engaged in learning new basketball skills, building self-confidence, and forging connections that extend beyond the court. In his remarks, Prime Minister Dr. Drew emphasized the camp's vital role in addressing crime and violence, tapping into the deep potential of sports as a force for positive social change.
Sports, in our context, is not merely recreation. It is an avenue of resistance, of resilience, and of renewal. For our young people who are here and hearing my voice, these courts become your classrooms. The lines of the court become lines of discipline, of dignity, of determination, and every bounce of the ball becomes a beat in the rhythm of nation building.
Dr. Drew highlighted the collaborative effort that brought the camp to fruition, acknowledging the contributions of the Prime Minister's Office, the Department of Sports, the St. Kitts Amateur Basketball Association, the Achievers Sports Club, and especially Thomas Kelly, whom he described as
the manifestation of what can happen when community meets vision.
The coalition, the Prime Minister noted, signals a crucial chapter in the story of national progress and hope. He repeatedly underscored the significance of community engagement.
Your presence is more than a highlight. It is a headline of hope for our youth. You are living proof that dreams can take you from modest beginnings to magnificent heights. Thank you for lending your experience, your stories, and your mentorship to our young people here in St. Kitts and Nevis. We will be eternally grateful.
Addressing the systematic challenges faced by young people,
let us not forget our young people. Do not struggle from a lack of ambition, but often from a lack of access. That is what they suffer from. The camp is part of my government's mission to change that.
He asserted that this mission extends across various sectors, including education, employment, entrepreneurship, and sports, aiming to build
a sustainable island state that invests in our people from grassroots to greatness.
The Prime Minister elaborated on basketball's unique power to provide structure, a sense of belonging, and a healthy outlet in a world where many youths are marginalized.
It is a tool for social development, crime prevention, and nation building. This is about preparing champions for the game and for life.
Dr. Drew urged the community to embrace the initiative's broader significance.
We are planting seeds, seeds of discipline and pride. And may those seeds grow into forests of greatness, not only here in St. Peter's and Sandy Point, but across every community in our federation.
He urged the young athletes to commit fully to the opportunity.
To our young athletes, play hard, play fair, and dream without borders. Let the echo of your sneakers on this court become the sound of a generation rising. And know that your community, your Prime Minister, your government, your country, your people, your families are all rooting for your success.
The basketball camp at St. Peter's Hardcore marked a significant step forward in cultivating the talent and potential of young people in St. Kitts and Nevis, harnessing sport as a vital instrument in community empowerment and national development. The U.S. government recently announced that the Caribbean region, through tropical shipping, will be exempted from proposed tariffs aimed at Chinese-built vessels, a decision that officials say will preserve the vital maritime trade lifelines across the Caribbean. Recently, the United States Trade Representative unveiled a comprehensive two-phased plan designed to counter China's overwhelming dominance in the maritime industry while revitalizing American shipbuilding. The initiative introduces new fees on Chinese-owned and Chinese-built ships, calling at U.S. ports starting after a 180-day grace period, with charges set to escalate gradually through 2028. Additional tariffs will target foreign-built vehicle carriers. Importantly, exemptions are granted to U.S.-owned vessels, smaller ships, and certain vessels enrolled in export or government programs, reflecting a targeted rather than blanket approach. Phase 2 of the plan, launching in 2028, will impose requirements for a portion of U.S. liquefied natural gas exports to be transported on U.S.-built and U.S.-flagged ships. The mandate is to be phased in over 22 years. To encourage compliance, operators who commit to purchasing American-made ships will benefit from fee waivers. Furthermore, the U.S. government has proposed steep tariffs, up to 100%, on Chinese-manufactured ship-to-shore cranes, which raises concerns about national and global trade vulnerabilities. These steps follow an in-depth investigation which identified China's maritime practices as unfair and detrimental to global competition, fostering harmful dependencies. While the final tariff structure remains pending with official ratification expected in May, the United States trade officials have confirmed that the harshest per-vessel levies will not apply to Caribbean nations. Caribbean stakeholders have hailed this exemption as a critical safeguard, though discussions continue to assess any indirect economic impacts the evolving tariff regime might pose to the region's maritime commerce. The Caribbean Private Sector Organization, CPSO, under the leadership of Dr. Patrick Antoine, has played a pivotal role in these developments and will continue to engage with U.S. officials to ensure the region's economic interests are protected as trade negotiations progress. The CPSO's efforts underscore the unity of Caribbean governments, business leaders, and trade organizations in presenting a cohesive voice on this issue. Among those celebrating its tropical shipping, one of the Caribbean's most significant and most long-standing maritime carriers, headquartered in Riviera Beach, Florida, and serving the Caribbean since 1963, tropical shipping will be spared from the substantial surcharges proposed initially. The United States Trade Department has sought to impose port fees that could have added approximately $3,000 per 40-foot container to Tropical's customers, a cost increase that would have significantly threatened to disrupt shipping affordability and access. Tropical Shipping President and CEO Tim Martin said that the agreement was a huge victory for them and the Caribbean region that they serve. Quote, "Our voices were heard. We could not have accomplished this without the relentless advocacy from our Caribbean representatives in Washington, D.C., our customers, and the many organizations that wrote letters to the United States trade representatives describing the devastating multiplier effect these port fees would have had on us all." End quote. Martin revealed that the United States Trade Committee members were surprised by the massive and coordinated response from Caribbean leaders and businesses. Martin offered heartfelt thanks to broad coalitions, including local employees and customers, as well as political leaders such as Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett and Governor Albert Bryan of the U.S. Virgin Islands, President Mohammed Irfan Ali of Guyana, and Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, who also chairs the Caribbean Community CARICOM. Additionally, organizations such as the Caribbean Shipping Association, Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, Caribbean Tourism Organization, and prominent U.S. congressional representatives supported the advocacy efforts that culminated in this exemption. Looking ahead, Martin committed to ongoing engagement with policymakers in D.C. to develop forward-looking strategies that will enhance the U.S. shipbuilding industry while preparing carriers like Tropical Shipping for emerging challenges in global maritime trade. Tropical Shipping's extensive services encompass refrigerated and dry cargo transport, full and less than container load shipments, small package delivery, cargo consolidation, inland transportation, and global logistics solutions, making it a vital artery in the Caribbean's supply chain. The exemption not only protects the immediate economic interests of Caribbean maritime commerce, but also symbolizes the power of regional collaboration and effective advocacy. It affirms that Caribbean voices cannot be sidelined in global trade policies that directly impact the region's connectivity and economic well-being. The U.S. government's measured approach strikes a balance between the strategic imperative of challenging China's maritime dominance and fostering American industry growth, while also considering the practical realities of existing trade partners and regional sensitivities. Caribbean nations can now breathe a sigh of relief knowing that their critical shipping lines will continue unhindered under current policies. At the same time, vigilance remains essential as new rules and tariffs unfold in the coming years. In regional news, tributes pour in from the region following the death of Pope Francis. Triple T Live Online has that story.
Tributes and prayers continue to pour in around the globe and right here in Trinidad and Tobago, following the death of Pope Francis, the leader of the Catholic Church. Roman Catholic Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon said Pope Francis was a faithful disciple who kept the joy of the gospel alive in the hearts of the faithful, even as he called us all to a deeper love within the family, for our common home, for the poor and marginalized, and for one another across every boundary and division. Prime Minister Stuart Young said Pope Francis focused on uplifting the poor and vulnerable and, in the modern world, was known for his desire for peace and the promotion of international diplomacy. The Prime Minister said the Pope was a known advocate for action on climate change and called for more protection for migrants and others who found themselves in vulnerable circumstances. Political leader of the United National Congress, Kamala Persad-Bissessar, said Pope Francis's life will forever serve to us all as a reminder of our obligation to build a culture locally and globally in which the strong protect the weak and justice, fairness, dignity, and progressiveness is God's ultimate gift for humanity. The Vatican on Monday announced the 88-year-old Pope died at Casa Santa Marta, where he lived. The Vatican later revealed the Pope suffered a stroke that put him into a coma and led to heart failure. The Vatican also said Pope Francis had relayed in a final statement his wishes to be buried at the Basilica of St. Mary Major in Rome. One day before his death, Pope Francis greeted thousands in his open-air Pope Mobile at St. Peter's Square after Easter Mass. The Pope, the first Latin American pontiff, was admitted to hospital on February 14th for a respiratory crisis that developed into double pneumonia. He spent 38 days in hospital. President of Trinidad and Tobago, Christine Kangaloo, has also joined the international community in mourning the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis. In a letter dated April 21st to the Dean of the College of Cardinals, President Kangaloo expressed deepest condolences to all within the Vatican and to the wider community on behalf of the government and people of Trinidad and Tobago. President Kangaloo said Pope Francis served with deep compassion, humility, and unwavering dedication to uplifting the marginalized and addressing the most pressing social challenges of our time. The president said Pope Francis brought a unique and empathetic voice to the Vatican, reshaping the global church's mission with a focus on mercy, inclusivity, and social justice, and noted his leadership inspired millions and opened new paths for dialogue among people of diverse beliefs.
When the white smoke cleared on that March night in 2013, Argentina's Jorge Mario Bergoglio emerged as Pope. It would be a series of firsts. The first Pope from Latin America, the first Jesuit, the first to take the name of Francis. A month after being released from hospital, Francis would deliver a final blessing to the world before departing at the age of 88. Of the 47 trips he made, Trinidad and Tobago was never one of them, but Francis made this country a leader of the Catholic Church in the Caribbean. Under his pontificate, Bishop Robert Llanos was ordained. So too was Bishop Clyde Harvey. Archbishop Jason Gordon was moved from Bridgetown to Port of Spain and given oversight of other jurisdictions.
What I have lost in his passing is a voice of conscience. What I've lost in his passing is a spiritual father. What I've lost in his passing is a mentor and a guide.
Vicar General Father Martin Sergiu, who met the Pope on a trip to Rome last January, hailed Francis's simplicity, his smile, and his holiness. And the tributes went far beyond the Catholic Church. Anglican Bishop Claude Berkeley says Francis brought a Latin America and Caribbean touch to the papacy. ASJA hailed Francis as a tireless fighter for peace in the Middle East. Both Prime Minister Stuart Young and opposition leader Kamala Persad-Bissessar hailed the Pope's humility, while President Christine Kangaloo said his leadership was transformational. U.S. President Donald Trump ordered American flags be flown at half-mast, while Archbishop Gordon ordered the same for all Vatican flags in TNT. The Pope leaves behind a synod he started in 2021 aimed at transforming the Catholic Church. For some, his death creates an uncertainty. But for now, the world mourns a man who was bold, brave, with a mixture of modesty. Ryan Bachu, CNC3 News.
We now bring you these international reports.
To the US, and in a few minutes here on the programme we'll be with Katrina Perry, who's in Ohio today, gauging the mood among businesses and ordinary Americans as we approach the first 100 days of the Trump administration. But let's start by checking in on the markets. Well, the New York Exchange opened to more market turmoil. Another wave of uncertainty after Donald Trump made it clear he wants to fire the Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Legally, it's thought he can't, but that may not stop him actually trying. All of that, again, scaring investors. So let's go to New York and to Erin Delmore. And Erin, the Dow is on course for the worst April since the Great Depression. No sign of an end to the uncertainty, is there?
No sign of an end to the uncertainty, Matthew, and that's exactly what has investors so on edge these days. You know, a bit of news, solid news about whether the tariff rates could be lowered or permanently adjusted would really go a long way towards shoring up investor confidence here, but we're not seeing that. Instead, we're seeing pauses and rumors of negotiation and a sky-high tariff rate on Chinese imports into the U.S. and U.S. goods imported into China. So what does that mean? Well, we saw all three major U.S. indexes close more than 2% lower, and now we're a bit of a bump up back. You know, right now, all three indexes are in the green, edging close to 2% up, seeing a little bit of that bounce, a little bit of shoring up. But again, it just comes after a very sharp sell-off. And to put things in context, Matthew, we so often talk about these movements up and down. But if we go back to April 2nd, to the day when President Trump announced his so-called reciprocal tariffs on Liberation Day, we now see all three major U.S. indexes more than 9 percentage points down since April 2nd. That, for me, is the headline.
It is really interesting what is going on, because normally when US stocks fall, so do foreign stocks. That is not happening at the moment. Investors switching from American to foreign stocks, some of which have had their best results inside the last 52 weeks. So that is new. Now, given what you were saying, what is happening on the markets, yields from bonds again going up, there's pressure on the dollar, and that is putting enormous pressure on the president on economic policy, isn't it? Which partly explains why he's going toe-to-toe with Jerome Powell.
Yes, I think you've really put together well all of the pressures that are facing the economy now. And President Trump has found his boogeyman in this. He's decided to target Fed Chair Jerome Powell. And we see this in repeated posts on social media. You know, he's nicknaming the Fed Chair Mr. Too Late. He's calling him slow. He called him a major loser. These are pretty classic types of techniques by President Trump to put pressure on people in government who he disagrees with. And the disagreement right now is President Trump thinks that the Fed Chair and the Federal Reserve as a whole should lower interest rates, which he says would make borrowing costs cheaper, and they would make borrowing costs cheaper for consumers. But the Federal Reserve here is trying to safeguard the economy and trying to keep a recession from taking hold. They have two mandates here. One is for maximum employment, and the other one is for price stability, and they're trying to fight inflation. So Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has indicated that the Fed is not ready to cut interest rates, and this is really what's leading to that standoff. Chair Powell has said that he can't be terminated by law, and he intends to serve out his term until his post is up in 2026, spring of 2026. But President Trump has said, if I want him out of there, he'll be out of there real fast.
Now, the IMF has downgraded US growth forecasts by nearly 1%, 0.9%. Last week, we heard the managing director highlight the dangers of Donald Trump's tariffs to the global economy. Well, with me here in the studio is Darshini David, our Deputy Economics Editor. And as I say, Darshini, a downgrade from the IMF. They went through a variety of countries. Just talk us through the headline figures here.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, Matthew? We've talked about this a lot in the last few weeks. 2nd of April, of course, President Trump basically ripping up the World Trade Order as we've known it. Now, that's caused the IMF, unsurprisingly, to rip up its forecasts as well. It's brought out several scenarios, in fact, because like the rest of us, it doesn't quite know what's going to happen. These policies keep changing all the time. They have downgraded global growth. They say it'll be somewhere between 2.5% and 3%, or maybe just over 3% this year on average. That is quite a downgrade from the previous figure. When you look beneath the surface of what's going on there, it's not going to surprise you to hear that it's the US where we're seeing that major forecast change, now expected to expand by less than 2% this year. Now, that doesn't mean that they're forecasting a recession there. So that's part of the reason why we heard Erin there talking about the stock markets and Wall Street. It's part of the reason why you've seen the stock markets rallying a bit in the United States. Having said that, we've heard the chief economist from the IMF talking in the last hour. He says the risk of recession in the US is close to 40%. That's up from 25% in the autumn. So you can see where the risks lie.
Quite a jump. Now, as well as what you said about the US, take me through the downgrade to the UK, because as well as a downgrade in growth, they've also pointed to inflation figures that perhaps may well be, if it plays out this way, the worst in the G7.
It could be, but there's some interesting things going on at play here. Now, as you mentioned, there's been a downgrade to the UK's growth forecast. It's 1.1% the IMF reckons for this year. That might sound familiar because that's broadly in line with what official forecasters here in the UK are saying. And indeed, the IMF, when they were asked what exactly is going on here, talked about the tariffs. They also talked about some of the domestic forces that play here. Remember, there's been tax rises, etc., etc. And again, some of the inflation changes we're likely to see are due to things like the way energy prices are regulated here. So those things in combination make it quite tricky when you're looking at, quite frankly, the economy after a tricky few years over the last few years as it's been.
It is tough, given the government here keeps talking about growth, and that has not been going the way they wanted. To have a downgrade like this, well, that is more problems on problems. Let's talk about the sort of trade deals that all of these countries are trying to negotiate. I was struck by something the Japanese delegation said over the weekend, where they said it is proving difficult to make progress because every time they meet with American officials, there is a new thing on the table. That is problematic. That is something we've heard before from other countries as well, which suggests some of these deals may well not be in the short term that perhaps people are hoping for.
Indeed, because the clock is ticking here. We do know, don't we, that a lot of these countries have only got a temporary stay, so to speak, when it comes to those extra retaliatory tariffs, so-called retaliatory tariffs, we should say. But on top of that as well, the US holds a lot of these cards. Trade negotiations are always tricky, but there is this deadline. So you can see more and more countries, the UK included, sort of thinking, well, actually, we're never going to go back to where we were before with the complete elimination of the Trump tariffs. We may just see some of them stopped in their tracks. But as you say, every time they come back to the table, we're hearing this from a lot of countries, more and more obstacles are put in their way. It's going to be nail-biting times. The IMF says if we were to take away these trade barriers, we get back to seeing the kind of growth prospects that we talked about before. That doesn't seem to be happening in a hurry.
Brazilian farmer Moises Schmidt is developing the world's largest cocoa farm. He plans to revolutionize the way the main ingredient in chocolate is produced, growing high-yield cocoa trees fully irrigated and fertilized, in an area bigger than the island of Manhattan. From watering to the application of fertilizer, the farm will be almost entirely mechanized, with the only exception being fruit picking from the trees, said Schmidt. The $300 million project comes as the global cocoa industry is facing a crisis. More than 60% of the world's cocoa is grown in Ivory Coast and Ghana. Production there is failing from a mix of plant disease, climate change, and aging plantations. Prices nearly tripled in 2024, hitting a record high just under $13,000 a metric ton in December before retreating. For Schmidt and other farmers in Brazil, the crisis is viewed as an opportunity.
It surprised us. We didn't expect this drop in production, this increase in demand to happen so quickly. But it is also worth highlighting an unmet demand that we had not seen in the world. If you look at the Americas today, there is a pent-up demand for this product.
Schmidt's planned 24,000-acre farm is the largest and most innovative in the region, but not the only one. Other supersized projects are under development, as farming groups look to apply industrial-scale agriculture expertise to cocoa production. If those plans work out, the industry could shift from West Africa back to Brazil, where the cocoa tree is native. But some cocoa researchers are worried the mega projects are based on thousands of clones of the same type of tree and could become vulnerable to diseases. Brazil was once second in global cocoa production, but a devastating fungus in the 1980s decimated crops. Schmidt estimates as much as 1.2 million acres of high-yield cocoa farms could be in place in Brazil in a decade, which could produce as much as 1.6 million tons of cocoa. Currently, Brazil produces only 200,000 tons, while the world's top producer, Ivory Coast, harvests 10 times more.
At this church in Ivory Coast, some African Catholics are hoping that one of their own could become the first black pope in modern history. Among them, Jean-Luc Guebert. He says his greatest wish is for the next pope to be a black man. And if not, then a white man who is truly a leader. However, while some African contenders' names have been circulating, Vatican insiders are skeptical that any of them have a realistic chance. That's partly because none have been subjected to the same level of public scrutiny as most Western cardinals. And that is a potential concern for an institution that has been shaken by devastating scandals in recent decades. Though there are several arguments for an African pope. The continent boasted around 20% of the world's Catholics in 2023. It is also, according to Vatican figures, where the Catholic Church is growing fastest. And some suggest an African pope is long overdue. Scholars researching the early church have cited evidence that some first millennium popes were born in North Africa or were of African descent, though details are scant. Among African names tipped to be potential candidates are Ghana's Cardinal Peter Kodwo Appiah Turkson, Ivory Coast's Cardinal Ignace Bessi Dogbo, and the Archbishop of Democratic Republic of Congo's Kinshasa, Fridolin Mbongo Bissungu. The elevation of an African cardinal to the papal throne would be widely interpreted as a continuation of Francis's track record of standing up for the poor and oppressed, migrants and civilians fleeing war. But an African pope would not necessarily embrace Francis's more socially progressive positions. In particular, approving the blessing of same-sex couples on a case-by-case basis has already angered Africa's overwhelmingly conservative faithful.
You were listening to the WINN FM 98.9 newscast. Our top stories were: IMF World Bank Spring Meeting 2025 opens amidst global trade war. St. Kitts Nevis Prime Minister continues to advocate youth empowerment through sports. Caribbean secures significant exemption from U.S. tariffs on Chinese-built ships amid new trade measures. Tributes pour in from the region following the death of Pope Francis. Internationally, U.S. growth forecast to be hit hardest from Donald Trump's tariffs, International Monetary Fund says. Thank you for listening.